here because we are working on garden soil remediation, and I'm interested in learning about how to remediate soils. I'm the grounds and facilities coordinator for this center.
Todd Spangler, teach chemistry and physics here at the high school, been here almost 20 years or so. And a couple students here.
Hi, I'm Abby.
I'm Jessica.
Do they get extra credit?
I wish.
They get appreciation of a job well done. So, they've led several, you'll hear in a little bit, they've led several parts of the project. We applied for an EPA award. It was a bummer we didn't get it related to the project, but they were kind of coordinating the students' work applying for that EPA award. So that's the reason why they're here today. They kind of were involved in some of the big picture work. So and I appreciate them tremendously, and that's the kind of stuff they can put on college out.
So we're going to start with a brief summary of our story and how to identify herbicide contamination if you're wondering if you might have it or a friend. It takes a village. We're going to talk about all the support that we've had along the way to make this project possible. Then we're going to go into the big picture and talk a little bit about herbicides in our environment at large. Student background, Abby and Jess will take it away with their research and their remediation plan that we implemented this school year. And then we'll look at a little in-depth of the analysis of the results that we got. We'll look at next steps, our plan for moving forward, and also maybe talk about options for individuals and further research that is available, because there's a lot more that can be done around this topic. And then we have a little list of recommended garden material sources from people who are being really conscious about making sure that their materials are clean. We'll go questions and conversation, open it up to the room, and then if you guys are up for it, for the last half an hour, we can all go into the greenhouse and do a little bit of remediation together. And if for some reason we run out of time, that's fine too, but just like to have that hands-on option if we get there. So, our story. I was wondering if anyone has read the book or heard of the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. Has anybody read that one or heard of that one? I see two people who I've already talked to about the book. Okay. Well, I want to say that I recommend this book. It's all about living a creative life, and that might seem like a bit of a stretch of how it connects to our story and why we're all here today. But I think that creativity plays a big role in why we were able to do this project. I think the idea to remediate soil is an act of creativity and an act of courage. And if it weren't for this idea and this curiosity coming to all of us as a group, as a team, as with students and community members and teachers, I don't think that we would be here today, and I don't think that we would have gone down this route. So I just wanted to give a shout out to creativity. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, please look into Big Magic.
What's the name of the book?
Big Magic.
Big
Magic.
Okay.
Yeah, by Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love as well. Yeah. I was going to read from it, but I'll let you guys read it yourself. Okay, so really quickly, our story. I don't want to dwell on the past and the process that we've been through. I want to focus on the future and where we're going, but I think it's important to understand how we got here. So around this time last year, early summer, we started planting in our garden beds that we had filled, and our plants very quickly, within a couple of days of planting, started looking funky. And when I say funky, I mean twisting leaves and curling stems and cupping leaves and just things that I had never seen plants do before. So I started to ask around. I asked my farmer friends. I talked to Brooke from Wicked Good. I talked to other people, Purple Frog, and they said, maybe you have a contamination situation. So Dennis Bronston, if any of you know him, led me to Kima with the Department of Agriculture. And she was nice enough to come over and examine our greenhouse take a look at the plants that we still had in the beds that I hadn't pulled out in a fearful frenzy, and see what was going on. She took samples of our soil, of our plants, and determined that yes, we did have contamination from an herbicide called aminopyrrolid, which is in Milestone as an example. It's in other brand name herbicides as well, but Milestone is one of them. So once we tested positive for herbicide, obviously there was a lot of fear, but we weren't going to let fear drive the car, and we were more curious about what are our options. So we started researching what could we do about this? This has impacted people across the state, across the country, across the world. What can we do? And around that time I ran into Mr. Spangler and somehow roped him in. He got curious too. And from there, it's all history. We collaborated with teachers, with students, with lots of community members to support us in coming up with a strong plan to test different remediation methods in our greenhouse. We tested those methods, and now we're going to talk about our results and move on to our next steps of remediation, because it's not over, but we've made some good progress. Really quickly, if you haven't seen herbicide contamination or herbicide symptoms before, you'll see here, this is a very healthy looking tomato plant, normal looking leaves, and herbicide contamination is a spectrum, so it really depends on the herbicide and the amount of herbicide that might be in your soil or in your water or whatever material it might be, straw, manure. And you can see here on the other end is what we still see in our greenhouse today when we plant tomatoes, and what we have seen all along is this really weird deformed growth, curling and twisting, and you can't really get any yield out of tomatoes and things like that when you have that sort of growth. So that's what we're looking at in terms of a healthy tomato plant versus a tomato plant impacted by herbicide.
I'm just curious, the people that are here have seen something similar? The people
Has anyone seen that before?
curl
Yeah.
leaves, typical, pretty similar to what we're seeing here.
Yeah. Okay. You might see cupping leaves if it's on peas or beans, so different, there's a variety of different symptoms that you might observe.
And Pat, is it pretty obvious, somebody who's worked with us all the time? When you see it, is it pretty obvious what you're looking at right away?
Well, not always, because it depends on the herbicide.
Uh-huh.
You know, sometimes it can look like a virus.
Oh.
So, but a lot of times, you know, you start asking questions. You know, did you put something on it recently? You know, where did they get the soil? That kind of thing.
Kind of leads you in that direction.
Yeah. Especially with tomatoes, there's so many diseases that tomatoes can get. It might be easy to just put it off as a disease or something else besides contamination. And I'll also just mention that when plants are in this state experiencing this impacted growth from herbicide, that they also become really vulnerable to pest populations. So you'll often see aphids and other pests just start swarming these unhealthy plants.
And was the tomato the most sensitive plant that you planted?
Yeah, we'll talk about that, but so the nightshade family is the most sensitive, tomatoes and potatoes. And then a little less sensitive will be your peas and your beans. Your legume family. And then brassicas and grasses may not show any symptoms at all, but they are still bioaccumulating or absorbing that herbicide. So we'll talk about that. Good question. This is an example of some of the symptoms that we saw in the greenhouse. This was a tomato that we planted. I can't remember the name, but something that the herbicides also do is sort of force growth to happen really fast in a dramatic way. So that's sort of the tomato like growing itself to death, if you will. And you can see the curly leaves a little bit on the peas there. That's our cover crop that we planted as part of our remediation. And the growth in January of this year. It should be 2019.
Taylor approached me in, I think it was August, right before the start of school, about a potential project related to this. And it worked out pretty well. my advanced chemistry class, we do year-long research projects, and so we always do a group project at the beginning of the year, just to kind of model the research process as far as your thought process, identifying variables, how do you control for variables and things like that. And usually it's maybe a month-long project. And this kind of tailored or fit in with that pretty well. It was a little bigger project, and so it actually worked out pretty well. I was a little leery at first, and I kind of had to get a little more curious and kind of talk to Taylor a bit more about what she was looking for, what her thoughts were, what would the product be, some of that kind of stuff. But after we kind of brainstormed a little bit, it's like, oh, this will be really interesting, and so it worked out pretty well. It was really interesting for me because to be honest, I've never gardened. This is totally new to me, so I learned a lot in the process myself. So it was really kind of interesting from that perspective. So we went ahead. Let me just grab my notes there for a second. I don't want to cover anything the girls are going to cover. So we went ahead and did a little background research to understand the issue a little bit better. And Abby and Jess are going to talk about that a little bit, just so we could kind of all get on the same page and kind of build our knowledge on what we were dealing with, what are the issues, how has it been addressed in the past, understanding a little bit about more about aminopyrrolate from a chemical standpoint, from a chemistry standpoint, how you test for it in the soil, some of those types of issues, so that we can have a better feel for what's going on. And so they'll talk about that a little bit, and then we developed a plan as far as split the greenhouse into different plots and how we were going to do remediation, what were our different approaches, and how we were going to do that. And they'll talk about that a little bit more. So in the meantime, we worked with several community partners, and there's a few that are here tonight, and we really thank them for their support, and their several made donations, not only of materials, but of their time and their expertise. And so Kimma from the Department of Ag was fantastic. And also the Department of Agricultural Lab in Bozeman donated $5,000 worth of, over $5,000 worth of aminopyrrolate testing, and some pretty high-end work that was going on there. And so that was highly appreciated. Dennis Bronston, he's a consultant from Kalispell, provided some technical expertise. Some people from algae aquaculture here. They donated products, and then also their expertise and their knowledge. We appreciate your support there. Green Cover Seed donated, I think, all of the cover crop seeds, right? All of the cover crop seeds, which I think we had a contact through Mr. Kazaza here at the high school, so Mr. Kazaza is involved in that. Robin from the Good Seed Company also provided some support, some suggestions and things like that. And Alyssa Chance, who is a former Whitefish graduate about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I think, had her in chemistry class. And so she runs Dirt Rich, mainly a compost company in Columbia Falls. And so she actually collects the compost here from the high school, or our lunch materials and things like that, and compost those. So they provided compost and also helped with the compost tea, which is one of the methods that we use in one of the test plots. So again, thanks to all the people that were involved and provided help. A lot of other people provided help too. And thanks to all those people. So.
Yeah, and I just want to say, without all of the help we got, we would not have been able to do this project at all. So really, so appreciative of all of our community partners. Can't say enough about them. I just wanted to mention, we already did a little bit, the donations, the time, the materials that went into this, and also the district impact. There are 6 teachers from the middle school and the high school in total that participated directly in the study. Over 11 classes participated in various studies, from worm counts to pH testing with Mr. Hoff's class, a wide variety of funny things that we were doing in the greenhouse. Over 220 students altogether from those classes, and then even more students from the elementary school and the middle school came and learned about plant identification, learned about worms, mushrooms, soil life, all thanks to the remediation project. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about herbicides in the environment in general, to kind of go big picture before we bring it back, zoom in on our specific situation here. So I think we all know that herbicides and pesticides are being used more and more across our valley, throughout the state, throughout the country, throughout the world. They're used in farm fields, in landscaping, in trails, parks, etc. They're all around us, and we're obviously exposed to all sorts of chemicals on a daily basis. But I don't know if we really think about how much we're exposed to herbicides and pesticides and how that's traveling through the land and through the environment. And because Montana has a really cold, arid climate and really cold winters, I think that people are starting to see a pattern of these chemicals persisting in our environment longer than maybe the chemical companies thought that they would. I've been told from other community partners that oftentimes these chemicals are tested in greenhouses and warm, humid places like Florida, and the impacts of how long they last and how long they persist in the environment that in Florida is a bit different than Montana. So I think we're a good example of that here. And just to give an idea of how herbicides are flowing through our environment once they're applied to a farm field or to your lawn or whatever it might be. There's leaching happening, so they might be going down into our groundwater. They might be absorbed by different organic matter and clay within the soil. There's also a bit of microbial decomposition happening, so microbes and life in the soil are breaking down those chemicals, and that's sort of what our remediation methods focus on. I'm not an expert on this, but chemical breakdown, there's volatilization and photochemical decomposition. There's also plants uptaking those chemicals, and certain plants are uptaking them more than others. You can also see just here how that might flow through our atmosphere, through our water system, our waterways, etc. So I've never thought about it before until we had to do this, but herbicide is traveling all throughout our environment, and just because it is applied in a certain spot doesn't mean it might not travel to another area via water or wind or whatever it might be. So we really need to support our microbial life and our plant life and do whatever we can to help that natural process of breaking down these chemicals that are around us.
Hi, I'm Jessica Henson. I'm part of Mr. Spangler's advanced chemistry class, and I'm going to talk about some of the background research our class did before we started. So at the beginning of the year, Mr. Spangler brought our class into the greenhouse, and we saw what some of the plants looked like and how they were being affected by the herbicide. And we understood that this was a problem, and we wanted to help fix it. So we started for, I believe it was a week, we broke up into groups and we researched about herbicide. So one group researched mainly about herbicide and the aminopyrrolid. So aminopyrrolid is what was in the soil, and it's to control broadleaf weeds. And then another group researched about how it works. So it's in the soil, but then you grow plants in it, and you'll see in some of the data later on, the amounts in the soil is much less than the actual amounts in the plants, and that's called bioaccumulation. My group researched about possible remediation techniques that we could look into, and it mainly focused on bioremediation and biostimulants. Another group focused on test methods and how we would test for herbicide. And one of the ways with bioassays, and I know they've been doing this with some of the outside beds, and then the inside beds got test donated from MSU labs, and so that was really cool. And then a last group researched about mushroom remediation, and mushrooms have been used to remediate soil in other areas when, say, there's an oil spill or some other natural or not natural issue. So that's kind of what our class researched about before we got started into our remediation.
Can you explain what a bioassay is?
I can help you out.
So, do you want to start?
Yeah.
So a bioassay is basically like a shorter term kind of lab project. It's you take a little bit of the soil, if I'm correct, and you basically you plant different plants and you watch it. You don't have any tests that you do, it's all kind of observational. And so you pick a plant that's very, very sensitive, like tomatoes, and you see how much it reacts to the elements that are in the soil. So if it doesn't grow at all, that's a sign that maybe there's something up with the soil, or maybe you just have a bad seed and you do it over again. It's just a shorter way to do it so that you're not taking, 10, 60-foot square beds, and then trying to do that, which would take a couple of months. And then you can do this, which takes maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
Thinking about over-application. Airplanes can put a lot of that poison out. Do they really know how much to put on the ground?
That's what Kimma Trainum does. She trains people in herbicide and pesticide applications. So as part of the training you go to be able to apply those chemicals, you do learn about amounts and when conditions, when to apply, all of that stuff. The interesting thing about the herbicide that is contaminated, is our contaminant, is that it is an over-the-counter herbicide. So you don't need any special training to, and lots of herbicides are. So, right, which may be a little more problematic. Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, depending on the level of the herbicide or the pesticide you're using, they have to, in order to be applied, you have to have this certification for this training. Is that correct?
Restricted use pesticides. Milestone isn't over the counter. You don't need a license. I do the private applicator. She does the commercial applicator training. But if you take it's like you could go get baby aspirin and eat too much of it. I mean, if you get it over the counter, there are directions on it. The label is the law, but then people do something different in their backyard and you can't control it.
But other things, they would have to go through your training class to be a certified
They have a
applicator.
license to buy it.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, to buy it.
And use it.
Yeah.
So we did do some initial bioassays to help confirm that we had contamination in the beginning. Since then, we haven't necessarily been doing separate bioassays. We've more been observing the plant growth in the different garden beds. However, now with our outdoor beds, we are conducting bioassays. And with every material that we get to put in the garden from now on, we do bioassays before we add it to the garden and potentially before we purchase it if possible. And so that allows us to compare. So for instance, I grew tomato seeds in potting soil that I know is certified organic and would not be contaminated. So I know what the healthy tomato plant looks like, and then I can grow tomato seeds in any other material that I'm questioning, and I can compare the difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're doing a semi-qualitative assay to try and figure out what's going on. But
Yes.
in terms of assigning your remediation, are you actually doing, correlating that with your mass spec results, or,
No.
what assay are you really using
No,
to determine whether you're successful or not?
Well, what we're doing is, according to Kimma, you can still see issues related to neuropyrrolid less than half a part per billion, which is our limit on our mass spec work, on our testing. It goes down to half a part per billion. Just give people an idea, you're talking half a part per billion. That's amazingly small.
But different mass spec methods actually can go down much more sensitive than that.
We just also don't have access to that.
Well, the lab developed, it took them a lot of time to develop their procedure to be able to quantitatively determine that. So, and they do this type of work they're one of the few labs in the country that does this kind of work. So, as far as using other mass spec procedures, we're relying on the Department of Agricultural specifications and their procedures, which have to stand up in court, and some of those types of issues. So I know a lot of work, according to what they shared with me, a lot of work went into developing those procedures. So, but we have not correlated, back to the original question, bioassay results with the mass spec results.
So the limited quantitation for the mass spec is actually only like a half a part per billion?
Yes.
Okay, so this is just the aminopyrrolid structure, and how it's structured makes it very, very difficult to break down. It is soluble in water, which is really good, but mostly it's broken down by microbes within the soil, so that's kind of how we came to the remediation plan. So we kind of broke up the greenhouse into 10 plots based on kind of the different remediations that we wanted to do as a class. So we had a control, of course, because when you're doing an experiment, you need to have something to compare it to. And then we did 2 fungi plots, one that was using a method, what was his name again?
Paul Stamets.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then there, because fungi has been proven to help kind of remediate oil spills and other kind of unnatural elements that are in the soil, and it's proven to be really, really effective. So we had kind of 2 methods of doing that, so we took 2 of our beds and focused on that. We did an activated carbon bed as well as biochar bed. So we had biochar and regenesis, and one of them, we separated the 2 because biochar used a lot less material, and we wanted to see how that held up against activated carbon, because both have been known to promote microbial life and help kind of break down different herbicides, different kind of unnatural, again, stuff in the soil. And then we also got compost tea and compost to help kind of enrich the life within the soil to then help the microbes grow and break down the aminopyrrolate as well. And then we did a cover crop only to see how much the plants would actually take out of the soil versus how much everything else was doing. And then we used another 2 algae aquaculture products, specifically Regenesis and regenesis. Regenesis is a biostimulant, if I remember correctly, and Regenesis is biochar mixed with regenesis, so that both helps the plants grow as well as provides a home for the microbes. So then you're increasing the amount of breakdown material that is in that soil. So for our cover crop, we planted a mix of sunflowers, oats, peas, and radish, and we grew them for about 3 months. We picked sunflowers, oats, and all of these simply because they grow within these different parameters, and they are proven to be really, really good at sucking up nutrients in the soil, and specifically herbicides. We also explored other variables such as the watering level, solar intensity, soil temperature, worm count, pH. We specifically did solar intensity and soil temperature due to kind of unusual growth within the greenhouse, but we figured that out. So in the end, what worked the best was the regenesis, and then compost. And all of these kind of decreased the herbicide levels from about 64 to 78%. Which are incredible numbers. Like seriously, when you're looking at decreases in herbicide, that's insane. And then from there, the radishes and the oats had the highest level of herbicide, meaning that they were taking the most, whereas the peas showed symptoms of herbicide contamination. So we're going to pull out all of the plants that we have currently growing. And then we're going to start sunflowers to transplant into some of the other beds later once they start growing, because they got some of the most amount of aminopyrrolate. And then we're going to apply compost to the garden beds, because that also proved to work really, really well. And we're going to use the cover crop seeds, of course, because they were proven to work. And then we're going to lightly cover the soil with leaves and or straw to help kind of provide a little bit of cover to help them grow. And then we're going to apply Regenesis weekly, which is, again, a biostimulant that you just spray on and it'll help your plants grow a lot quicker. And then we're going to apply compost tea weekly or every other week, and then continue this from May to July. And then we'll take samples in August, and hopefully they come back as non-detect.
Question?
Yes,
What happens then to the cover crops? What do you do with them?
great question. So we've been struggling with that a little bit. The first time we pulled the cover crops and everything in the soil, we took it off-site and had it burned. That was recommended by the Department of Agriculture and by Corteva, which and Dow AgroSciences, which created this chemical. And the second time, we gave some to Alyssa with Dirt Rich, and she's experimenting with composting that material to see if she can successfully break down the herbicide in her composting process. And other than that, sadly, we're just throwing it away. So, good question. It's challenging to know what to do with all of that material that we're pulling up.
So when we put on the regenesis products or the biochar, are you putting plants in those?
Yes. Yes.
And the plants that are pulling out the herbicide?
Right, they are bioaccumulating that herbicide.
And then one more question with that radish oats and the pea, and the peas showed more disturbance.
Yeah.
But you felt like the radish and oats pulled more product out?
We had all three of the plants tested, and the levels of, as you can see on the board, the levels of aminopyrrolid within the radishes and oats were much higher than the levels in the peas. So from
But
that,
the peas physically showed,
yes.
It's
and
also
the radishes didn't show anything?
Yeah. And
Okay.
the peas are just more of a sensitive plant.
Right.
So the peas are not extracting the herbicide out of the soil, whereas the radish and the oats are, correct? They're pulling more of the...
are, but just not as much.
Right.
Yeah.
So your best method to remediate the soil then is to use an oat or, your radish. That's going to extract the most out, and then build your microbe life in your soil at the same time. Kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So if we were at a community garden and we were going to develop a bioassay, what would you guys recommend for the control and the test?
For the control, I would just recommend buying a bag of organic potting mix. We use Pico, and then whatever material you wanted to test, I would do that in multiple pots with multiple seeds, and I would, have it alongside and compare the growth as it comes up. And if you're interested, there's some articles that have been sent to me of people who have done bioassays to study herbicide detection in soils, and it shows you can see the spectrum within the plants of the symptoms to no symptoms, and that really visually helps you to identify without spending $250 on that herbicide test.
A 2-week time frame, I think you mentioned?
Like 1 month.
Oh, 1 month time frame.
Yeah.
Use a lot of composted cow manure from the local dairy. And have you had any experience with that? And because we were, concerned about, if they were eating, weed-free.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. Robin Kelson has been doing some really serious research to support some of our community partners in confirming that their materials are clean, and Kalispell Creamery is one of those who has been able to pretty much 100% confirm that their manure is clean, going back to their sources of exactly what they're feeding their cattle, what those farmers' practices are, all the way back, and they're also sending out samples, I believe, to confirm that with the lab tests. But also, many organic farmers in the valley have been using Kalispell Creamery manure for, 20 years, for instance, with Judy with Terrapin Farm, and highly recommend it. Yeah, so that's definitely a material that we'll be looking to in the future.
Let me just make a clarification as far as making conclusions from our work. It's important to realize that this wouldn't be publishable because we haven't reproduced it, and so we're obviously limited. We don't have a budget. We're relying on donated tests and things like that. So it's really important to take that caveat as far as making interpretations from the work we've done. It's, general impressions and things like that. Saying definitives are maybe a little bit hard to do at this point. To be totally honest, it would take a lot more work, a lot more money, and things like that. We're not a research lab, so but it's
just been a community effort of
yeah,
learning.
and so it's just kind of general impressions. I think would be maybe a good way to put it at this point.
I'm just going to do a quick rundown of our tests over time. So last July, our initial test that we did with KIMA, with the Department of Agriculture, showed 3.8 parts per billion of aminopyrrolid in the soil and 58 parts per billion in the plant tissue from plants that were growing in that. Second soil tests ranged from 0.5 parts per billion to 7.5 parts per billion when we took them in September. And then we did the third round of tests in February after our remediation concluded. And those soil tests showed a decrease overall in aminopyrrolid, and that ranged from 1.2 to 4.9 parts per billion. So we saw a good decrease, but we still saw the levels of herbicide higher in the plant tissue samples than they were in the soil, which continues to point towards the idea that the plants are bioaccumulating that herbicide. And those tests were conducted by Mr. Spangler's and Sachtel's classes with the help of Kimma right alongside us.
So the plants are getting rid of the herbicide in a natural way, and then when they die off, it's gone. It doesn't retain to stay in the soil?
Well, it takes time for, they're bioaccumulating some of that herbicide, but not all of it.
Okay.
And
Right.
the herbicide is still in the plants once the plants are pulled, which is why we have to throw them away or burn them.
Yeah, because there's been no research on the effects of amino
Now, if
acids.
they're used for compost, then it reestablish the herbicide?
I mean, possibly, there hasn't been a whole lot of research into that, so we don't know whether or not that amino pyramid breaks down.
Yeah, but there have been
Yes.
incidences of herbicide in compost in many other states. So it's definitely a possibility depending on how that compost is being processed.
I'd like to hear Pat McGlynn's comments concerning the legality of using this and why it's here, why it's used in our county.
Well, I don't know if you'd say the legality. I mean, people have been using pesticides since the 1920s. I mean, it's legal. So, but some of the herbicides have more residual because if you're using it on a wheat field and it's a monocot, you're preventing the broadleaf weeds from competing with that crop for a long period of time. So when it's used, in certain ways, it really helps the farmer. So that's why it's legal. So sometimes these soils get moved. I see all the time cropland being excavated and sold. And that farmer never knew that that soil was going to be taken off that farm and end up in somebody's garden. And I'm just saying that the ramifications of the things we do, we always have to think of the consequences. So
This is sort of a big table, but basically Mr. Spangler calculated the percent change of some of all of our methods, and we're looking at our most effective ones here. Obviously, we can't be completely confident in this data, but if we do a round 2, and if we assume at least a 78% drop again, because we're going to use regenesis with the cover cropping and compost tea, we think that our levels in the greenhouse will be low enough that they hopefully will not affect our plants, and they'll be non-detectable by the mass spectrometer, and we can move forward.
That's why it's hard, because it all depends on the original concentration.
Right.
And that's the issue, how many rounds are you going to have to do?
Does the USDA have any standards or safe amounts in vegetables, fruits, crops? Is there any guidelines for use of?
Not for aminopyralids specifically. It's considered a low toxicity herbicide, and they say in livestock most of it is going through the digestive system and out in the manure, which is why manure can be a challenge. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but aminopyralid isn't typically applied to crop fields that are going to be consumed by people.
And this kind of relates to one of the questions earlier. I mean, our thought is when we do a bioassay, if we don't see any visual impacts, that's when we're going to feel comfortable that we're in a good spot.
Right.
That's generally what kind of our discussion has been at this point, because that level is probably going to be lower than what the lab in Bozeman can test for.
So I kind of want to move us into the microbial piece. We've been talking a lot about the bioaccumulation and the important work that plants are doing to absorb these chemicals, but there's also a really important piece about soil life. And so one of my favorite studies we did was worm counts in all of the beds, was soil before remediation and soil during remediation. And we saw a big boost in almost every garden bed in our worms, which made us really happy. Because we've been learning a lot more about the soil web and the food pyramid within the soil and the importance of life in the soil. So there's one big takeaway I hope you have from this, it's the importance of life in the soil.
So just to point out, Site H had up to 85 worms in a liter.
Yeah.
This volume of soil had 85 worms in it. I mean, it's crazy.
They weren't in that bottle, but.
Okay, so here's the question of why did the compost and the regenesis work the best out of all of our methods? There's a lot of variables in the greenhouse. There's a lot of variables in our research project. Obviously, you know, we're not, again, it's not something we're going to publish, but we think that there is some significance to those two methods working really well. And as I've thought about it and sort of ran it through my head in the mix with all of the education I've received over the last few months about soil life, I really think that the compost and the regenesis are feeding the base of our food chain in our soil, and that's a big reason why they work the best. So to kind of put it in perspective, you can see here the food web, the soil food web, and the soil food pyramid, and just how much bacteria and fungi and protozoa and nematodes and mites and worms and roly-polies and everything else is in the soil that we take for granted, that we don't really think about, that we don't really see. Yet all of those creatures, microscopic or not, are doing amazing work in our soil. They are the ones that are helping to break down the toxins that we put into our environment on a daily basis. And the work they do is absolutely amazing. So when I've talked to soil experts and I've asked them, what do I do and what's the best thing? You know, they mention cover crops and this and that, but worms again and again comes up. One of the best things you can do, because the worms are also helping to break down these chemicals as they're digesting, as the organic matter is going through their systems. So also we really need bacteria and fungi in the soil, something we don't think about and that we often kill in the soil when we spray chemicals. So for instance, herbicide, I've been told by Nicole Masters, who's an amazing soil expert, kills that foundational life in the soil. It kills those microbes, and therefore it breaks down the whole soil web. So we have to rebuild up those populations in order to create healthy soil for our plants again. I'm not expert, I'm still learning, but I can't stress the importance of supporting that microbial and fungi population in our soil. If you think about it, plants are communicating and interacting with all of those things. All of the roots that are down in there are communicating with the fungi, and they're trading. They're trading food for food, nutrients, back and forth to each other. They're supporting each other when diseases come, when pests come, things like that. And you know, the more we support the soil life, the healthier our plants will be, and the more it will break down, literally break down that toxic stuff that's in there. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please look into Nicole Masters, or John Kempf has awesome podcasts on regenerative agriculture. Patty Imberster is a local person here in Montana who does amazing work on this, and our own local Robin Kelson, obviously, as well. Okay, so I think overall I just want to say that our methods are kind of twofold. One is bioaccumulation, and the other is supporting microbial degradation of those chemicals. And that's sort of the methods that we're going to carry forward as we continue this remediation process.
So Taylor, do you feel pretty confident at this point that this is going to take care of it, or do you think there may be a day when you say, we got to take the soil out of here?
Good question. Yeah, we've had a lot of debates about this, especially in Mr. Spangler's class. And it's been really good learning opportunity for us all to think through the realities of the situation that we're in. I think based on the results, I feel pretty strongly that the soil in the greenhouse will be hopefully completely remediated this year. I feel strongly about that because our first remediation was conducted in the middle of winter, where plants were growing a lot slower. We're not getting nearly as much photo degradation, our temperatures were low, and now with all of that mixed in with the greenhouse, with the plants growing so much faster, with microbial life booming, the worms doing their work, I think we have a really good chance of being able to grow food and feel comfortable serving that and with our students by the end of this year. Maybe by the end of this summer, but that might be wishful thinking.
What about the beds outside?
The beds outside are on a little bit of a slower timeline. We don't feel as pressed to have those ready for consumption, food consumption, and we don't know the state that they're in at all because we haven't done any tests on them. And they were mixed with some different materials than what went into the greenhouse beds. So we think that maybe the contamination might be lower in there. And so we're conducting bioassays right now to see where we're at with the outside beds. But we also think that the snow and all the water, excessive amounts of water that went through those beds throughout the winter may have supported that process a little bit too. Does that answer it?
Yeah, thank you.
It's still a bit of a mystery.
I noticed in your list in the previous slide that you were, when you seeded your cover crop, you were recommending straw or leaves over it. Mm-hmm. If you use straw, how do you know you aren't reintroducing
Right. You need to
herbicide?
get organic straw, and there are a few sources of that in the valley. But then you have the
But how do
weed
we know it's
situation.
organic?
Well, there's, I think there's some certified organic sources, but I can't remember the names of those sources right now. So I personally wouldn't use straw, I would use leaves as much as I could get my hands on, but I'm running out of sources for leaves, so I may need to look for another option. We're using up all the leaves in the city of Whitefish, so if you know anyone who has leaves, we could use some more.
City of Kalispell has 1,000 cubic
Oh, yes.
yards of leaves.
I forgot about that. Yes.
Rotate, over a 4-year period, about 1,000 cubic yards.
Right, and you only have to pay for the dump truck to come and pick it up?
Or you buy a dump truck.
Right, sure. Great.
Because you can sell a dump truck for the same price that you had it for about 5 years later.
Cool. So that big soil pile, if you saw it out front where the gates are open, is actually composted leaf mulch from the city of Kalispell. And we'll continue to get that. And I'm going to talk about those sources in just a second. But I just wanted to briefly go over key takeaways for individuals and others who are interested in attempting some remediation, if you're as creative as we are, and some good practices in general. I've learned to have no bare ground on your soil. I know people think they need to take everything away, take all your leaves off, and have your garden looking all perfect with just your soil and your plants. And I've just been taught in this past year that we should have no bare ground, because all of that mulch you put on, those leaves, that dead material, organic material, is all feeding your soil life. It's feeding your roly-polies, your worms, your bacteria. It's putting carbon and sugars back into your soil. So as much as possible, don't have bare ground. Whether you need remediation or not, you're going to have a much healthier garden if you can avoid that. Also, sugar water. It's been suggested that spraying a very small concentration of sugar or molasses in water on garden beds will really increase your bacterial populations, and that will really support remediation. And so I listened to some podcasts again by John Kemp, and Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, I believe is the name of it, where he's helping conventional farmers transition to organic by simply growing cover crops and spraying like a pound of sugar per acre on their fields.
I have a challenge to that.
Yes?
You know that the sugar beets are all GMO now and sprayed both at the beginning and to kill the foliage with Roundup. So I would never trust regular white sugar.
Okay.
Cane sugar maybe.
Good point. Thank you, Jeff. I haven't tried that. I'm interested in it, but we may have to go with what we've already studied. So if anyone else is interested in trying that, that would be super cool. Let me know if you do. Compost tea is another. Our compost tea wasn't that successful. I think it's because the quality was not very high in our compost tea, meaning that we didn't have a really large population of microbes. And so we're going to work this summer on learning how to brew compost tea more successfully. The algae fertilizer, I can't recommend enough regenesis and Regenichar. It's right here. It's a local product. It's a great people. And I mean, the results were just astounding. And we could see it in the growth in our beds. It was the beds that had those products had the best growth by far throughout the whole remediation process. So great job, ladies. I know that was your method. Well done. Compost from Dirt Rich. I also can't speak enough about Dirt Rich and their compost product, their fungal product especially. Alyssa is amazing, and there's tons of worms and good stuff in her compost that will really feed your garden. Cover crops, I would definitely continue. Radishes have that nice deep taproot. If you can get a forage radish, that's really ideal. I think it really helps to bioaccumulate and suck up that herbicide, as well as anything with just a large deep root system, like the sunflowers. And I've heard that native grasses and other native plants can be really effective for remediation. We haven't tried that yet, but we'll talk to Haley about that one with the Center for Native Plants. So, and finally, I just want to say that we should start using our backpack sprayers to spray compost tea and regenesis, and stop using them to spray other things, if you know what I mean. So I have 2 of those, and they're awesome for applying compost tea and regenesis in our garden beds. Okay, and then the last thing I'll say about garden materials, I can't say enough about lasagna gardening. This is something that we did do in our garden beds to an extent, but we didn't do it all the way. So if you have the time and the resources and the availability of these materials, I would highly recommend building your own soil. That's the best thing you can do to assure that you're getting clean products. So dirt, I would recommend all of these. I can't say 100% that they're clean, but I can say that, you know, a lot of people are using them and haven't had issues that I'm aware of. So Dirt Rich Compost, Pico is certified organic potting mix. Kalispell leaf mulch, it can have garbage and things in it, so be careful. Always wear gloves, but it's a great product, I think. Kalispell Creamery, a lot of people recommend them. Branches and logs, if you can layer that in the bottom, is really great and will introduce fungi into your soil beds really quickly. We have a lot of mushrooms growing in our beds just from those branches and logs, so we're super excited about that. And wood chips and box of rain, awesome for lots of good gardening products. And I'll leave you with some compost tea thoughts. And any other questions or thoughts or comments that you want to share, we can open it up. And yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for being here.
The backpack sprayer, you had the compost tea in. Were you applying the compost tea to the foliage?
Right. So we are applying it to the foliage as well as the soil.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
Once a week?
yeah, we're
Once a
going to
week,
do
yeah.
once a week. Patty Ambrister recommends that, so we're going to increase to once a week. We were doing
You were doing
every other week.
sugar too, weren't you?
Hmm?
With the sprayer, the sugar.
You could do the sugar with the sprayer, yep, as well. And you could just put a little molasses in your compost tea at the end.
We didn't do that, but you could use that.
Okay, I thought you were doing it.
No,
We didn't do the sugar.
learned about that along the way. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's another variable. I mean, then we could have gone a gajillion different
Where you
ways.
go 1,000 different.
Exactly, we got limited space and limited number of tests, so.
Yeah.
It's really good to add molasses to your compost tea at the beginning, because that helps the microbes, it helps build the microbes, they repopulate, they use those sugars from the molasses to actually make more microbes. So then you have like a really dense microbial tea.
I just have a little personal story with the millstone and my experience with it. So when we moved into our property outside of town here, we had a little hawkweed, which we mowed around because it was such a pretty little flower out in the field. And then pretty soon we had more hawkweed. And so I checked with somebody and they said, oh, the natural way to kill it is with 16 fertilizer. So I put some 16 on it, it burned it and killed it. So, well, we've got quite a bit of hawkweed now. So I get a 25-pound bag put it on there. Well, I fertilized it because I put a ton on, but it wasn't enough to burn the hawkweed. So I go to a local Kalispell feedlot and ask for the least toxic herbicide, which turns out to be the millstone or the milestone, whatever it is. And it wasn't until 2 years later I read in Mother Earth News this very thing, that these people had used manure from fields and then their garden collapsed. So it's like, wow, this is the least toxic herbicide that's available to the public. And there may be others, but you know, you have to find other ways.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
I'm curious, as algae aquaculture, have you guys had, I'm sure you're interested in the results. You guys have a plan going forward as far as researching your product related to, you know, this type of application?
We're doing studies up in Canada for the soil remediation on the wellheads.
So a petroleum oil issue.
So the first round of testing came back, and the company uses microbes, and they added regenesis to their protocol, and it actually increased the efficacy of their microbes by 24%. So they're doing a second study, and we'll see how that comes back. So we're just, and this kind of happened the same time this study happened with your class. It was really interesting that we had all that. So yeah, we want to keep moving forward with, but we don't have a plan per se.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how kind of all that develops, you know, potentially.
Well, and that's why we wanted
potentially another market, maybe.
Right, and I think that, you know, that's why we wanted to make sure that Taylor could do a second round and, you know, if need be, a third round, because we want to see what's going on. I think if we do the second round and the plants, your bioassays are looking good, maybe that's the time to do a tissue study, and then that answer would say, I can eat this or not. And
thank you all for coming.
We've got a webpage for the project, so it's on my webpage for the school district. So
Microbes or worms or whatever it might be. It's Tuesdays and Thursdays from 8 a.m. to 12, and that'll start on June 27th. So look out for this poster or click on the info. I hope to see you this summer. Thank you all for coming.